What does it mean to be a good person? Are we supposed to be good to uphold universal moral laws or maximize happiness to the greatest number of people? How are we to act to be good people? Many modern normative ethical theories focus on the moral actions one ought to do or the consequences one ought to bring about, but typically nothing is said about the motives of the individual performing moral actions. Is the hate-filled man who is nice and kind to people only to fit into society an ethical man? Sure, his actions are moral, but there is something deeper to ethics than action. Ethics should be about making people better. Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle's key ethical work and the subject of this video, lays out a theory of morality defined by the virtues, one aimed at showing what distinguishes the good life from a vicious one. So what is the grounding of morality? What is virtue? How do we know what the virtues are? And how do we decide what actions to take to be moral people? Aristotle believes that humans have a special function that gives us our moral quality. He makes a keen observation that there seems to be a clear difference between the human animal and all other animals that humans have observed. Being alive is a shared trait even by plants, which he says have no moral standing. So the moral trait cannot come from things like nutrition or that we grow. We see that other creatures have sentience, a feeling of pleasure or pain, but are not moral creatures. What humans have is rationality, which is the defining characteristic of man that makes him moral. He writes, "And if we declare that the function of man is a certain form of life, and define that form of life as the exercise of the soul's faculties and activities in association with rational principle, and say that the function of a good man is to perform these activities well and rightly, then from these premises it follows that the good of man is the active exercise of his soul's faculties in conformity with excellence or virtue." He clearly states that the telos, in Greek meaning purpose, of a man is defined by his rational capacity. The good for men is to live out their function, to be moral, which therefore is to be rational, and to be rational therefore is to live a proper life. The proper life seeks a particular end as well. Aristotle uses the word eudaimonia to describe this end, which in English can be translated as happiness, flourishing, fulfillment, or the good life. But why should we seek this particular end rather than others? He says, well, that's simple. All you need to do is look at the universal observation that flourishing is something that everyone wants, and secondly, that people want flourishing for the sake of flourishing alone, not in the same way as they want wealth or a good career, which are aimed at other things like legacy or social status. In fact, if you analyze any desire and continually ask why you have it, then it seems like all of our desires are oriented towards this type of flourishing. The desire for money, for example, can be to spend it. Well, why do you want to spend it? Let's say to buy nice things. Well, why do you want nice things, etc., etc., is ultimately because you wish to live a good life or be happy or to flourish. Aristotle calls this the chief good, the end which we desire for its own sake. And if this is the end of all of our desires, then it must also be the end of our ethics. So if eudaimonia is the good, and the function of a good man is actively exercising his rationality, which is to say, acting virtuously, then we can only achieve our flourishing or happiness or the good life through becoming virtuous. Aristotle says that eudaimonia is not just possessing the virtues, it is the outcome of acting virtuously, but also taking joy in virtue. He writes, "The man who abstains from bodily pleasures and delights in this very fact is temperate, while the man who is annoyed at it is self-indulgent. And he who stands his ground against things that are terrible and delights in this, or at least is not pained, is brave, while the man who is pained is a coward. For moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on the account of pleasures that we do bad things, and on the account of pain that we abstain from the noble ones. This is key to virtue. True virtue produces fulfillment in the actor. In fact, virtue is just what fulfillment is. So the man who acts rightly but does not desire to do so is in conflict with reason, as it should be within his desire to act in accordance with reason, which dictates that we act virtuously, because that is how we achieve happiness. The highest moral state is one with such a well-formed character that one wants what reason dictates, and is pleased with every virtuous action, such that virtue becomes second nature." Aristotle writes, "The agent must also be in a certain condition when he acts. In the first place, he must have knowledge. Secondly, he must choose the acts, and choose them for their own sakes. And thirdly, his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. Thus, although actions are entitled just and temperate when they are the acts that just and temperate men would do, the agent is just and temperate not when he does these acts merely, but when he does them the way just and temperate men do them. It is correct, therefore, to say that a man becomes just by doing just actions, and temperate by doing temperate actions, and no one can have the remotest chance of becoming good without doing them. For example, to be charitable, you actually need to give to a charity or to those in need. You should give for the sake of charity, not another reason, like increasing happiness or a personal gain. And you should actually enjoy being charitable. But the question of what it means to be charitable in the proper way is still left on the table. A heuristic Aristotle offers to solve this issue is the rule of the golden mean. Virtue lies in the middle of two extremes of behavior. Courage lies between rashness and cowardice, modesty between humility and pride. But through practical reason, we can see an appropriate response. Virtue is the rational expression of a well-formed character guided through the habituation of virtue so that our deliberation, when we act, becomes both reasonable and natural. By observing those who are exemplars of virtue and those who fall into excess or deficiency, we sharpen our practical reason and learn how to act well ourselves. Through such exemplars, our practical reason is trained to discern the right amount of feeling and action. In practice, then, we can watch an exemplary figure, such as a soldier who neither charges recklessly or cowers from danger, but is courageous. This is the means to learn what courage looks like. But to know what courage is, we must act courageously ourselves. In ethics, we must not look for a mathematics of conduct. The subject matter of human conduct is not governed by necessary and uniform laws. Practical and moral rules are only general and always admit of exceptions. At their very best, practical rules state probabilities, not certainties. Hence, moral experience, the actual possession and exercise of good character, is necessary to understand moral principles and profitably apply them. One of the biggest challenges to Aristotle's ethics in modern philosophy is its reliance on rationality as the natural purpose or function that defines the good life. Materialism and positivism have cast doubt on the idea that any cosmic purpose for humanity exists, and with that, Aristotle's foundation collapses. Although modern virtue ethicists have shown that virtue ethics does not need telos to preserve human flourishing through virtue to be the ultimate end of ethics, philosophers have reinterpreted Aristotle's theory in naturalistic terms. Human nature is that we are social, cooperative animals. This grounds what it means to flourish. Virtues are those traits that help a human flourish according to the kind of being that we are. No grand purpose is needed. Others have completely dropped the idea of a life purpose. Agent-based theorists ground virtue in motives and intuition, judging that the virtuous actions come from good, caring, or benevolent motives. Almost every critic of Aristotle's ethics cites moral ambiguity as the theory's most serious issue. Specifically speaking of the golden mean, it is very hard or even impossible to make sense of the claim that every virtue is the mean between two extremes. Virtues like honesty, fidelity, or justice seem to break this paradigm. It is extremely difficult to see how you can have an excess of fidelity, justice, or honesty and still be called immoral. Furthermore, virtue ethics offers no clear moral directives. It relies heavily on virtuous agents to emulate, which leads to relative morality and to those without exemplars, without any moral guidance. One might also act differently on different days in identical situations depending on character inclination, and still be called equally virtuous. This is in sharp contrast to consequentialist and deontological theories with universalizable principles. Going on to Aristotle's particular qualification for moral standing, that being Greek male citizens, is just deeply sexist and racist. The exclusion of women and other races seems unjustifiable by his own logic that creatures with rational souls are the ones with moral standing. A final philosophical critique is that Aristotle's definition of virtue seems circular. He says essentially, virtues are the traits possessed by virtuous people, and virtuous people are those who possess virtues. That doesn't tell us independently which traits are the virtues. It risks a tautology. The good person is the one who does good things. Modern virtue ethics has worked to ground virtue in something less circular. One strategy, as mentioned, is to connect virtue to human flourishing. For example, virtues are those character traits that benefit their possessor, and are conducive to living a truly good human life. In this vein, the virtues are just those character traits that enable a human to flourish. This gives us a substantive criterion. We can study which traits typically allow humans to thrive personally and socially. Qualities like honesty, courage, kindness naturally emerge as candidates. Another approach is the exemplarist approach. Rather than starting with abstract definitions, it starts with concrete examples of admirable people and says those are our reference point for virtue. We identify virtues by seeing patterns in what admirable individuals share. For instance, we find that people we admire for moral greatness are consistently compassionate, honest, just, and so on. And that gives content to the idea of virtue. This isn't viciously circular because it anchors the concept of a good person in the reality of human moral emotion. Agent-based theorists likewise appeal to our common sense moral intuitions. Virtues are those traits that observers across time and cultures have found admirable or praiseworthy. For example, virtually every society values courage and condemns cowardice. And such consensus suggests that these traits have objective value for human life. Through study and reflection, virtue ethicists refine these intuitions into a coherent list of virtues, subject to debate and experience, but not arbitrary.